Wishing you all a very happy new year. Happy 2023. This is our first event of 2023. We had a very successful 2022 as far as the events, the initiatives, and our projects were concerned. We have sent a newsletter to all of you to tell you and outline all the events and initiatives that we did in 2022. If anyone here has not received the newsletter, please write to us and we will definitely send you the newsletter. Please follow us on our Facebook page. Please visit our websites for the upcoming events so that you are in touch with what IIBM plans to do in 2023. Our most successful event of 2022, for me, again, as that's my opinion, was our International Vedic Maths Olympiad 2000, the second one that we did again in November 2022. Almost 2,000 students from 11 different countries participated in this global competition. We had students as young as 7 years, and then we also had open category where adults also participated in the different levels of the Olympiad. The results or the performance of everyone was very commendable. And now to continue, we do plan to do it again in 2023 per our newsletter. It will be again in the November. But we think it's the right time to start preparing for the IVMO 2023. And what better ways than to understanding how to study smart, right? Like how do we accelerate the learning techniques so that we get the best results from the efforts that we have put in. So to kickstart 2023, we have with us Richard Blum, who is going to talk on accelerated learning methods. Richard Blum is an actuary, been an actuary, Vedic math teacher, Vedic math researcher, and author all of his adult life. He has presented online workshops and papers, both nationally and internationally. Rick is also the author of Math is Not a Four-Letter Word, an introduction to the study of Vedic mathematics. Today's workshop is entitled Accelerated Learning Techniques for Learning Vedic Math. And with this, I hand it over to Rick. Rick, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good morning to a few of you, and good afternoon and good evening to most of you. I would like to thank Swati and James of the IAVM for asking me to speak today. I would also like to thank my good friend Reggie for helping me to prepare this presentation. When I was in high school and college, I studied extremely hard. I earned decent grades like B's, B pluses, and occasionally I'd even get some A's. I was a common student earning common grades. In my classes, there always seemed to be individuals that earned A's all the time. I could not figure out how they were doing it. My conclusion was that they were just smarter than I was. No matter how hard I would study, they were just smarter than me and not only earned higher grades, but remembered what they learned far longer than I did. Fast forward many years, and I've come to realize that I was wrong all this time. The conclusion that I had that they were smarter than me just wasn't true. The truth is that they knew how to study and learn in an entirely different way than I did. This is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to introduce you to a better way to study and learn. You'll notice throughout the presentation, I will make a distinction between studying and learning. Vedic math is a system of mathematics that accelerates a person's ability to solve many different types of math problems. What could be a better match than a system to accelerate one's ability to learn, a mathematical system that accelerates an individual's ability to do math? There are going to be many concepts to cover in a relatively short period of time, so my talk will be presented pretty quickly. Chances are that you will not catch all of it after hearing this presentation once. I'm sure that the IAVM will record this and make it available on their website, www.instavm.org. Alternatively, you may contact me directly at pensions@mindspring.com. Just to let you know what I will not accomplish today. The PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared will not be pretty, but it will be informative. The techniques that I'll be describing will not work immediately and need to be practiced. But I promise you, if you find out more about these high utility techniques and practice them, you will find them to be gold. Okay, let's get into the presentation now. Okay, hold on. Okay. Let's get this out of the way here. Okay. What is effective learning? Many students feel that using their study techniques to put information into their heads is effective learning. It is not. Effective learning puts material to be retained into short-term memory and then transitions it into long-term memory for retrieval at, for retrieval at some point in the future. Then the material is not only studied, but learned. These effective learning techniques will enable a person at all levels of education to learn any subject more quickly and effectively with long-term retention. Let's talk about short-term memory. What is it exactly? Immediately upon studying material and understanding it, it is put into short-term memory. The disadvantage of learning for retention in short-term memory is just that. The brain retains the information short-term. The table below illustrates this fact. When you study something and you feel like you know it 100%, that's your starting point. And let's say you don't look at it again for a while. Well, after just a few days, you can tell your retention rate falls dramatically. So then after almost a week, you remember very little of it. This is a very natural occurrence in people. And unfortunately, most people are not aware this happens, but it does. Typically, what study methods are considered low utility methods and put information only into your short-term memory? I'm going to lead you over here first. These are the methods that I used to study and learn in high school and college. These are the methods that most students use, and most professionals too, when they're trying to learn something. Standardly, highlighting and underlining. I used to do this all the time. Sometimes I'd have whole pages that were highlighted and underlined. You reread the source material. Very common, and this is the most common. You just keep rereading that source material again, again, and again. And finally, you'd be writing and rewriting your notes again, and again, and again. These are all referred to as low utility study methods. This is the way I learned Vedic math. It took me a long time. My retention of many of the mathematical methods was not very good, and I found learning VM at times to be tedious and boring. A difference in approach was in order. One thing I'd like to mention, all the information I'm giving you, all the facts that I'm presenting have been researched and there have been studies done, and these are the results of this research. Okay, so what are the disadvantages of these low utility methods? They take lots of time and become very boring. It takes information into your head and keeps it there for retrieval for a short time. This might be potentially useful for cramming. Personally, I never cram for a test, but when you study, it's all in your head. If you immediately take the test, you might do well, but over the long term, it's got very low effectiveness. It just doesn't stay with you. More importantly, by studying this way, you are not learning. Your mind is only going along for the ride. And what I mean by that is there are many times when you'll be reading a book And if you stop reading for a second and you ask yourself, what did I just read? What was in the paragraph of the page before? You're not going to have a clue. You're just, like I said, you're just going along for the ride. You're not really thinking about what you're doing. And this generates what's known as illusions of competency. You feel like you really know something, but you don't. Well, you may know it at that moment, but given a very short period of time, your ability to bring these things forward and use them diminishes. This is a very interesting chart. A large group of students were asked, what study strategies are there out there that you're aware of? Most of them say rereading the material again and again and again. And then it goes down, practice problems, flashcards, rewriting notes, study with a group, just plain memorize, use mnemonic devices, make outlines, practice recall, very low, highlighting and real life examples. And then these same individuals were asked, given all those strategies, what strategy do you use when you study? Overwhelmingly, people just keep rereading the source material, and everything else kind of falls by the wayside, including practice recall. Very, very low. So the best way to study and learn is by using active recall and spaced repetition. If you're going to take one thing out of this talk today, I want it to be this sentence. The best way to study and learn is by using active recall and spaced repetition. Study after study has shown this. Unfortunately, most people just aren't aware of them. So what is active recall? It's a type of learning technique that involves retrieving information from long-term memory rather than attempting retrieval from short-term memory. This process can help strengthen the memory of the information and make it more accessible in the future. I found that when these methods were applied to learning Vedic math, several things happened. My studying and learning became faster, deeper, and more enjoyable. My ability to retain VM procedures and techniques was greatly improved. This would happen to everybody if they use these techniques. So what are the various forms of active recall? There are many different forms of active recall. As one studies material, one can produce flashcards, quizzes, or asking oneself questions. Self-testing is the basis of active recall. You want to keep testing yourself. How do you do it? Flashcards, quizzes, or asking one's questions. Everyone has their own way of using active recall. I prefer the last approach. As the material is studied, instead of writing notes, you write questions for each important point. Orally answer each question using the Feynman technique, which I'll explain in the next slide. As I just mentioned, I prefer writing questions on the material as I am studying, as each important point is fresh in my mind, and then answering the questions orally. I am making my mind work at coming up with the answers to the questions. In this way, I am retrieving the answers from my long-term memory and not just going along for the ride. What is the Feynman method? Richard Feynman was an American physicist who was renowned for being able to explain difficult concepts simply. You will know that you completely understand what you're studying when you can explain it in a way that a young person would be able to understand it. Before applying the Feynman technique, you must first totally understand the material. This approach makes your brain work harder than the previously mentioned low utility methods. This is the whole point of active recall. Whenever you test yourself, you retrieve information from long-term memory. You cement that knowledge in your brain and it'll stay there longer. It'll be easier to retrieve in the future. Many people think that when they study, the most important thing is to get all the information into their head. Well, they've got it backwards. The most important thing when you study and learn is to be able to retrieve the information and have it come out of your head when you need it. So how do I do active recall? First thing I like to do is become familiar with what I'm going to be learning. And even more importantly than that, you need to read with a purpose. The worst thing you could do is just open up a book and just start reading and attempting to understand what you're reading. What you want to do is, let's say in Vedic math, you're reading a chapter on a particular set of procedures. Before I would read the material in depth and try to learn it, I would probably be asking myself some questions. How is this going to help me? Is this going to make me do certain types of math problems faster? What kind of math problems is it going to help me do faster? Read with a purpose. Know what you're trying to accomplish by reading this material. Next is you preview the material. Now, you're not doing anything in depth now, but you're just becoming familiar with the format and what's in the chapter or the book you're reading. Read back and front covers of the book or preview the first and last pages of the chapter to be learned. Read the table of contents and forward. See if there are review questions, summaries, or quizzes at the end of the chapter. This is an often overlooked thing to do when you're trying to study a chapter. The review questions or summaries or quizzes, if they are there at the end of the chapter, and many books have this. This is what the author feels are the most important things that he'd like you to take away from reading that chapter. So once you're aware of what he feels is the most important as you read through the chapter, you'll be looking for these things unconsciously. Flip each page just to get an overview. Read headlines in bold text. No in-depth reading at this step. Read the first couple and ending paragraphs. And finally, read the first and last sentence of each paragraph. Now you're familiar with the material, you'll now read it in depth. Write yourself questions on every important point. Make sure that you understand your questions and the answers to your questions. The way I do this, I usually do it on the computer in Word. I will list the questions and I'll list the answers in such a way that I have to click on a switch in order to see them. I don't want to just read questions and read answers. I want to read questions and try to pull the answers out of my long-term memory. That's the whole point. I'm testing myself to bring information out of my head. After you think you can explain the answer to each question, orally explain the answer using the Feynman method. Now, sometimes you might feel kind of silly orally explaining this to yourself, but this is what you want to do. Once you can orally explain the answer, simplify your oral answer until it can be explained simply. And bring it down to its essence. Now, there have been studies shown that even though a person would think they have the ability to study for hours on end, really focused and really making it beneficial for them to study that length of time, for most people, this is not the case. What happens is you start studying, your focus as you get into the material goes up, but then it starts to drop. And what happens is it drops way down and you're just not studying anymore once it reaches this point. What we do is something called the Pomodoro Technique. And I have a slide on that following. What you do is when you feel yourself start to slide, and usually this is about 25 minutes to start, stop and give yourself a 5 or 10 minute break and do something that you don't want to do, that is totally different from what you're studying. And then go back to it again. So go back up to high level studying and focus, and then it'll drop again. Well, again, as it starts to drop, take a break, and that'll bring you back up to where you want to be. High focus. And each time your focus will stay higher than it was the previous time. That's the whole idea here. If you're going to study, you want your focus to be high. You want to be as effective a learner as possible. And this is called the Pomodoro Technique. And it works like this. Decide what you want to accomplish and estimate how long you will study for. And break your work into called Pomodoros. What does this accomplish? For those of you that are curious where this name came from. There was an Italian researcher that did studies on this to realize that your highest level of focus can be maintained if you study for about 25 minutes and take five minutes off to do something else, and you break yourself into pieces. The way he timed himself on 25 minutes, he had this timer in the shape of a tomato, a Pomodoro. That's an Italian tomato. And that's what he called his technique, after his timer shaped like a tomato. So you set the timer for 25 minutes and you start studying, and you start studying hard. Minimize your distractions during the Pomodoro interval. And that is a general rule for any time you study. If an extraneous thought pops into your head, write it down for consideration later. If a friend calls, let them know that you'll call them back later. Turn your phone off, turn your TV off, turn your music off. After 25 minutes, take a short 5-10 minute break. Grab a cup of coffee, go for a walk, call back your friend, or do something else relaxing. Repeat this process. After 4 Pomodoros, take a longer break of 20 to 30 minutes and reward yourself for the good job that you've just done. Now, once you've done active recall, that's only half of the problem. Basically, you've now gotten this information into your short-term memory. What you want to do is get it into your long-term memory. The way you do this is using what's called spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is a learning technique that involves reviewing information at increasingly longer intervals of time with the goal of maximizing retention and recall. The idea behind spaced repetition is that memories fade over time. This is a very natural thing. You saw that from the forgetting curve early on. And they need to be reactivated in order to be retained in long-term memory. Spaced repetition keeps the material fresh in your mind so that it is more easily remembered when needed. This is what we're looking at. When you first learn something and you don't review it, in very short order, it's pretty much gone. After a day, if you review, in my case, I review all the questions that I wrote, which are in effect my notes. If I review them again, that brings me back up to 100%. And now, even though my memory of this material is going to fade, it's going to fade over a much longer period of time. And again, after a few more days, I review it again. Now it's going to fade, but fade much less. And again, over a few number of days, over a longer number of days, it's going to stay with me. Finally, after the third review, I'm going to get back up to 100%, and I'm going to stay between 90 and 100%. And it's now in my long-term memory, which is where I want it to be. So how do we apply these techniques to learn Vedic math? Most students study procedures to learn how to solve problems. Many students study a procedure rather than learning the essence of the procedure. What is it really all about? How can we study Vedic math with the objective of learning, not just studying, but learning Vedic math? Again, our objective is to command an understanding of a procedure and not just study it, but to learn it. Let's use our newfound knowledge of accelerated learning techniques to learn 2x2 vertically and crosswise multiplication. Okay, here's the example I'm going to use. 23 times 21. What are the procedural steps to follow? And this is typically the way you initially learn it. Starting from the rightmost column, you multiply vertically, 3 times 1, which is 3. Your second step is crosswise, multiply crosswise and add. 2 times 1 plus 3 times 2, that's 2 plus 6, which is 8. And finally, you multiply vertically on the left. 2 times 2 is 4. This yields a solution of 483. If this is as far as we study this method, this procedure will be forgotten in fairly short order. It is currently stored in short-term memory. What do we need to do to transition it to long-term memory? Now that we have a solution, why does it work? As we study how to solve this problem, write down questions on all the important points. After we write down each question, we use the Feynman technique as if we were explaining the procedure to a young person. For example, here are the questions that I would ask myself and then orally explain. Why did we initially multiply vertically? What does this represent? Why did we then multiply crosswise and add? What does that represent? Finally, why did we multiply vertically again? What does that represent? How do we put the final solution together based upon the first three steps? What would happen if any of these steps generated a carry? Now, I didn't explain how to handle that, but if you can answer the first 4 questions, you should be able to figure that out on your own. Think about it. Don't look for the answer in a book somewhere. Think about it. And this is how you learn it. Can you diagram the steps in this procedure? If you can do it, do it. Many times in Vedic math, solutions can be, and procedures to get solutions can be represented by diagrams. See if you could do that. Is it absolutely necessary to perform these steps in the order I've shown? If you understand the essence of what's happening here, you should be able to answer that. Can we start from the left and continue to the right? Again, if you understood what we're doing here, you should be able to answer that. Now, something to think about. If you're a Vedic math teacher helping your students to prepare for the 2023 Vedic Mathematics Olympiad, these accelerated methods will help your students to learn, not just study, but learn Vedic math techniques much faster than they ordinarily could. Additionally, your students will retain knowledge of these techniques longer than they ordinarily would, with a much greater grasp on the essence of the methods. This greater grasp will help them to answer questions that they couldn't otherwise do. Now, there were only 3 procedural steps to study and bring into short-term memory. What if there are 10 or 20 important steps to remember? How do we remember all these steps and in the order that they must be performed? The answer to this is literally thousands of years old. The method is called a memory palace or the method of loci. Now, a complete description of constructing a memory palace is beyond the scope of our talk today, but suffice it to say, you use a set of memories that is already ingrained in your long-term memory to memorize a lengthy procedure. And to see somebody do this, it's a remarkable thing to see, and it's not only easy to do, but it's a very fun thing to do. After you've memorized the steps in the procedure, write questions about each step. This step of writing questions and then answering them orally is technically referred to as the Feynman technique or elaborative interrogation. Do not go back to your source material unless there's absolutely no way for you to get the answer. You have now studied the procedure, but you have not yet learned the procedure. This is where spaced repetition comes in. Repeat this elaborative integration. I keep saying integration, I'm a math guy. Elaborative interrogation process again on the same material the next day, then 2 days after that, then 5 days after that, and then a week after that. At this point, the material will have transitioned to your long-term memory. You will now be able to retrieve and understand the material for a long time. You will now have learned the material. The good and bad of active recall and spaced repetition. When compared to the low utility methods of studying, underlining, writing notes, highlighting, the advantages are, believe it or not, it takes less time to perform. Studied material becomes learned material. Learning the material becomes more fun and less boring. Learned material not only is understood better, but is understood for a longer period of time. Using these methods had the potential to transform a C student into a B student, then turn them into an A to A+ student. There are disadvantages. Unlike some of the low utility methods where you're just kind of going along for the ride, these methods take more effort and thinking, not more time to learn. And I just put this last one in because it actually does happen. Students might feel guilty that they're studying much less than their friends and scoring higher on tests. Now, if you're interested in this, and again, it seems like even though these techniques have been around for quite a while, just so few students are aware of them, and even less students are using them. And they work. They absolutely work. Two good books to read if you're interested is A Mind for Numbers by Barbara Oakley and Make It Stick by Peter Brown, Redinger, and McDaniel. Also, and you all have access, I'm sure, to YouTube videos by these individuals will be a great help, especially Barbara Oakley. She has a Learning How to Learn series. Excellent. And by the way, all of these other website hosts, YouTube hosts, they're all either doctors or studying to be doctors. And as you can appreciate, if you're going to med school, there's a tremendous amount of information that you need to learn quickly and retain. And they've all been the other route, and they've tried this route, and it's worked for them very, very well. If any questions arise that you feel I can help you with, please contact me at pensions@mindspring.com. I hope you found this presentation valuable. Thank you.
Wishing you all a